long term, hiring people that come from different backgrounds and helping them engage and align against all those ideas will just lead to better outcomes for the business. And so it is diversity, building teams of diverse backgrounds is good for business, just like people first leadership is good for business.
This is the Business OS, a conversation powered by JustCall, dedicated to giving you the tools and knowledge needed to win your business. Be wired for discomfort. Seek it out. That's where growth happens. This is a quote on the profile page of our guest on the Peak 15 Partners website, and it certainly seems like a mantra she lives by. When she landed in the US in 2007, a career in sales was not really on the horizon. Her parents dreamt that their daughter would be a doctor or perhaps an engineer. But once she realized just how amazing sales could be, there was no stopping her. The road to sales superstardom was certainly not easy. Big commission checks came in fast, but so did stress, anxiety, and burnout. All part and parcel of the sales game is what people told her. So she signed on as the founder CRO of Lattice and changed the game. Taking Lattice to 100 plus in revenue in less than 4 years while building a culture that proudly declares to be people first is not easy. But our guest did that and then some. When she left Lattice in 2003 to take a well-deserved career break, the company boasted record growth and the lowest attrition rates in the industry. And while she would be the first to say that culture is a team sport, there's no denying her impact. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest today, Executive in Residence at Peak 15 Partners and former CRO at Lattice, Dini Mehta. Dini, it's so great to have you on the show.
Wow, that is such a kind introduction. Thank you for having me.
All right, awesome, Dini. We're just going to jump right in. So how does someone go from petri dishes to crushing pipeline, considering that you studied biology in college?
I have no idea, mostly through chance. I was a research scientist in college and, trying to figure out if I can be a doctor or an engineer and realizing that that's not where my passion lied. And so after graduating, I moved out to the Bay Area and fell into tech. I was lucky enough to get hired at a company with a lot of experienced folks. This was a company founded by repeat founders. They'd sold their first company to Amazon, and then they just started the second company. And here I was out of college, sort of the generalist on the business side that was doing everything, helping out wherever needed across go-to-market. And in hindsight, I was so lucky to land at a place like that where it was an early stage startup, but with experienced leaders. And I had the chance to sort of really dabble in all parts of go-to-market. And so, it was totally through chance and luck. And I'm grateful for it every day.
That sounds a great landing, for anyone who's sort of starting out. And you obviously became very successful at what you did. You mentioned once in an interview, though, that you were becoming one of the leaders who said it couldn't be done. What made you think Lattice would be different? In other words, what would it take to get, a Dini Mehta on board for any company?
I said that to that line, and I still stand by it, which is this was after I'd spent almost a decade selling to marketers. So I started in advertising, then moved to MarTech. And the company prior to Lattice also had a very similar run where joined Series A, single-digit revenue, and scaled it to 200 million. And that's where I grew up as a leader. I've been there for 5.5 years. And at the end of that sort of run at Drawbridge, I was thinking about what's next. And the traditional path would tell me to go to, sort of capitalize on the fact that I know so much about selling to marketers and MarTech. And so go take another role, which is a larger role at a company that's more established because, I get to capitalize on what I've got. But I felt that I was becoming a leader that was too jaded to stay in this space because I would just say things like, no, that can't be done. And I didn't want that for myself and my career. And so I was seeking out something that I hadn't done before and something that would make me super uncomfortable. So I think one of the reasons why I thought Lattice could be, why Lattice might work is because I didn't know any better. And I think that's the honest truth is sometimes it just takes a little bit of ignorance and passion to go figure it out. Because it wasn't easy. It was just as hard. The difference was that I wasn't bogged down by my own experience of what can and can't be done. Instead, we were forced out of our comfort zone, and we were sort of thinking in terms of first principles and how to build how to build this thing and do it in a way that feels very authentic to us. And so, yeah, that's sort of what triggered my search and how I thought about the opportunity at Lattice.
That certainly sounds incredible. And, honestly, one of my questions for you was going to be, it can't be easy, to make those decisions, to be so honest with yourself, and to be able to say this is working or this is not working and I want to try things differently. So clearly that took a lot of, courage and gumption to do that. I do think you answered that though in part by, talking about how, it's still being sort of early in your journey. I think you didn't have to pile on a load of experience, so to speak. And, maybe that made that decision a little easier. I think for everyone who's listening in, I think it's really important, even as the years go by and, you have a lot of experience in what you're doing, to continually just sort of check in with yourself and make sure that you're still on the right path, or, the path is going where you want it to go now. So I think there's a lot to be said for, everything, for all of that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think one of the things, I've never been someone who, when I first started in sales, there were people, my peers, that would say, I'm going to be a CRO or I'm going to be a VP of sales. This is when we just started off as an IC in a sales org. And I wasn't that. I didn't know if sales was for me. I didn't know if what I wanted to do next. And that gave me a lot of anxiety back then when I was starting out. But how I learned to manage that anxiety was just to think in terms of 18-month increments. And it's very freeing to say, how do I just do a really good job at what I'm doing today? And then learn from it in terms of what am I good at? What do I like doing? What do I not like doing? And what does that mean for the next 18 months for me? And where do I take my career from there? And so I think that habit was born out of a lack of conviction in terms of where I want to take my career. And honestly, I live by that today, which is I don't know what the next 18 months is going to look like. And I think it forces me to think in terms of put a beginner's mindset on and be really thoughtful about my own strengths and weaknesses and what I actually enjoy and don't enjoy, and use that to make some decisions around my career. So I think it's sort of born out of a weakness, and now it's become a part of how I manage my career.
And I think, going over to what is clearly one of your strengths, and that's people, right? And we've heard you talk really so much about people first leadership. Could you maybe take us a little bit through what exactly you mean by people first leadership?
That term, I didn't know that that's what it was called for a while until I landed at Lattice, and then we put some words around it. But I've always been this person because I wanted a manager, and I've had a lot of great managers and I've had some not great managers. So that helps sort of shape what you want to become as a leader. And for me, it was, in sales, there's this lot of sales orgs that are built on a foundation of fear and scarcity. And so you're typically pitting one team against another. You're sort of viewed as a number in your output instead of what you bring to the table. And that always felt off to me. And so I wanted to see if there was a different way to build sales org specifically, and bring the humanity back into sales. Like one of the examples when I first started in sales was, I remember we'd go sit in a meeting and the manager would say, here's all the things we need to do. We'd all agree, okay, leave the meeting. And then everyone on the team would be like, we're not doing that. We just said yes to the manager. And my mind was like, wait, what? Why would we say yes to something we're all agreeing that is not a good use of our time? Like, why wouldn't we just tell the manager that? Like, it was just, I didn't understand it. And so when I became a manager, I really wanted a dynamic where people could openly disagree with me, challenge my decisions, help throw out ideas that may be better for the business. And so I think that requires a foundation of psychological safety, which I think is like core to people first leadership. It's like you've got to create an environment as a leader where everyone feels safe to bring their authentic self and share feedback in a very direct way. Two comes transparency. You can only create that if you're very transparent about what's going well, what isn't going well as a leader. So transparency plays a critical role in sort of building the right pillars around people first leadership. And then finally, I like to win. And that comes with accountability. Like you can't have an amazing culture and lots of transparency, but you're not delivering results, because ultimately it's about outcomes. And the best culture is a winning culture. And so I care deeply about accountability. And I think that is accountability, transparency, and psychological safety together make up what in my mind is good people first leadership. Because, accountability is an interesting one, because when people think people first, most people think it's like, oh, it's the soft stuff of like taking care of your people, but it's not. It's about holding people to a really high bar and coaching them to their potential. And so, yeah, that's how I think about people first leadership.
Dini, those sound like really great principles, both as principles but in practice as well. But we all know that human behavior can be unpredictable. People, people across on the same team can be different. And when it comes to sales, and especially competitive, right, there's that added element as well. It can't be easy at all times to sort of do this new way of leadership, and not just leadership, but of being on a team, right? What were maybe some of those challenges along the way to establishing this culture?
Yeah, it's not easy, especially because most salespeople have been wired, me including me, where you've come from this environment where you've got to sort of show up for yourself. You're pitted against your teammates, you're pitted against other teams on the same company. And so, you're wired for that, and your behaviors are wired for that. So a lot of this comes down to like really reiterating the culture we're building and how values play an important role. And we want to build a culture of abundance, not a culture of scarcity, where someone winning on the team doesn't take away my ability to win as a rep, right? Like there's enough to go around. And I think that's an important framework to instill in the team early on. But I think so much of it is like, you have to believe in this ethos, and it has to be part of everything you do. How you run meetings, how you hire, how you promote, how you fire. Like sometimes you've got to make the tough call of somebody that's a good performer, but isn't good for the culture and isn't sort of following your values and is doing things that aren't ethical or moral. And the right answer always is to make a change if they're unwilling to go with your way of doing things. So definitely not easy, but the reality is that there's more salespeople out there that want to find a different way of, yes, performing and delivering revenue and still having quotas and still having that sort of competitive element, because that doesn't go away, but also doing it in a collaborative way where you can help your teammate, and that doesn't take away from your ability to get to quota. And there's something magical about it, because it's mentally, you feel like you're part of a community. And so much of meaningful work comes from feeling like you're part of a community, feeling like you're growing and developing every month, every quarter, and you're part of this larger mission and purpose. So I think, even commission-driven, quota carrying salespeople want the same things out of work, which is, how do I part of a great team? How do I feel like I'm growing and developing? And then how am I sort of contributing to a larger mission?
I definitely do resonate with so many of the things that you're talking about, right? Whether that's psychological safety and doing that for your team. I know, and I see myself, how much of a difference it makes to people when they know they won't be judged or they won't be left out, or, they find the right sort of collaborative atmosphere that they need. And especially for us in marketing, right? Like, it's honestly super important. Like marketing, this could be true of any function really, but marketing is completely a team sport. Like there is no way, like, you can succeed at what you're doing without, a few other people also, not working with you, because it's literally like an assembly line in a lot of ways. And
Yep.
even though you own your own projects, but you really are dependent on so many other people to bring your vision to life. So yeah, so lots of great learnings around there on building that culture overall. And, while we're, of course, talking about hiring and sadly firing as well, clearly building, the culture of an org is really critical, but you also need to be able to hire the right people. What's your advice for founders, when they're maybe hiring their first 50 folks?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Because I think hiring plays, it's everything in the early days. Because if you can find great people to join your mission, everything becomes easier. And the team you build is the company you build. And so it's it all starts there. From a hiring standpoint, early on, I think a lot of times it's easy to get sucked into the resume pattern matching game of like, I want someone from my competitor, or I want someone that's worked at this company or with this sort of specific domain experience. And sometimes that may be required for the type of company the founder's starting and representing. But in 90% of the times, like early on, you just want generalists that are passionate about what you're selling. They're smart and they'll figure it out. That's what you need. You don't need to overly focus on functional experience. I've always erred on the side of I want someone who's values aligned and culturally a really good fit for this stage of the business versus overly focused on their experience levels. And I can see why, right? You're like early on, oh, I want someone who's been at a large company because they've gotten the training, or I want someone that's been at a competitor because they know the space really well. But most times it doesn't translate. Sometimes you'll find the person that knows how to navigate in your environment. But I really think it's like over-indexing on the attributes that you need for a specific role versus the check boxes on experience that, I think most people end up defaulting on. Fun fact, like the first 20 folks on my team at Lattice had no HR tech experience, which was, and partly by design, because I didn't have an HR tech experience, and I wanted to hire a bunch of people that were also just passionate about our mission and didn't have that experience to see if that helps us, not be bogged down by experience. And so I think taking a very first principles lens at who you should hire at what stage, what attributes, and then how does that impact your team composition is like how I would think about building your first 50 team members, because that is the foundation of growth for your company. And those are the people that are going to get you to 200 and 500 and 1,000. So super critical to be thoughtful and intentional and not over-index on specific resume companies and experience.
Yeah. And I think honestly, as someone who's a hiring manager often enough, I think just putting check boxes or checking those off is simply because sometimes we don't want to think beyond. We're not willing to sort of think beyond or think outside of the box or think even first principles, right? I know it's almost a piece of jargon now that gets thrown around a lot, but it's actually really useful. Because if you're going to think first principles, you'll realize that there are, a certain set of attributes, like you said, or behaviors that you need for any role. And it's okay to just think about those and put those down on a piece of paper or software rather than, grab something off the internet, look at who's working at a competing sort of company, and then check off, those boxes. But that means that the hiring manager and the company needs to support that, but the hiring manager needs to be thinking from those principles and needs to do that work and really be committed to building a team in that way, and not just names, for the company, but really people who are mission driven, as you put it, right? Like there's no substitute for people who work with you because they believe in what you're building together, right? Like I don't think money can buy that, at the risk of devaluing what we do daily at work and the salary we paid for it. But I don't think money can buy people's passion and, the energy of people who really believe in what they're doing. And just sort of related to that, right? You've often also talked about diversity in companies and, being cognizant and intentional about hiring for diversity. I'm curious if you think diversity is something that smaller startups or companies should also focus on, or is it, let's get to, 10 million or 20 million and then think about hiring in a particular way or building a team in a particular way?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I think the reality early stage is like, you're typically pressed for time. By the time you're hiring, you're already behind. You don't have as many resources. You don't have that much supply coming in that's interested in the company. And so like you're starting off with some real challenges and limitations to make an impact, even if you care deeply about diversity. So I totally recognize that the dynamics are different early stage, but in an ideal world, you want to do it as early as possible. Because if you've deprioritized that early in the interest of making the hire or just finding people to join your company, you will feel that later on, because it's harder to convince someone that, oh, we care about diversity when early on you haven't been able to prioritize that. So I think the earlier you can do, the better. Diversity comes in so many forms. It can come in terms of work experience. It can come in terms of their background. It can come in terms of in terms of sort of their upbringing. Like there's so many forms of diversity. And I deeply believe, and I've seen it in action, that diverse teams are higher performing teams, because you're not, in some ways, it's easier to hire, a bunch of folks from the same company, like people you may have worked with or people from a specific competitor, because it's easier. They all have a common language. They work together. So I can see the argument of, well, this is a more efficient path. But long term, hiring people that come from different backgrounds and helping them engage and align against all those ideas will just lead to better outcomes for the business. And so, building teams of diverse backgrounds is good for business, just like people first leadership is good for business. And you have to believe that as a leader to invest in it. And I'd say the earlier you can make strides towards it, the easier it'll be later on to hold that as a value.
Dini, you've obviously, sort of set up your own teams, and you've also worked, and now, of course, you do work with other founders and companies as well as part of your work here at Peak 15. I'm curious about, the most common challenges that you see founders or CEOs face when it comes to sales. And that might sound like a really wide question, but I'm curious on whether you see certain patterns, especially when it comes to sales, on what they're missing out on.
I think one common trap I see a lot of founders fall into, especially early stage technical founders, is they get over reliant on data analysis. I think the reality about go-to-market is it's easy to understand, it's easy to measure. And so that leads to this dynamic of, well, I'm going to try to understand every metric, every conversion, every cut of the data to try to make decisions about the business. And later on, that makes a ton of sense. Like past 50 million in revenue, you've got enough historical data, you've got enough in the data to help you make decisions. But even then, I am a huge fan of using your instincts and your market knowledge and your customer conversations to make decisions about your business, and use data to validate those or identify the problems you should be thinking about. But don't use data to make all your decisions. It's just, I think it's a trap, and it feels like the right thing to do because it's scientific and it's like math and we all like numbers and logic. But sometimes the best decisions are made off of instinct. So I think that is one of the common traps I see across the board is people start over analyzing all their data. And while there's some good reason to do it, there's some real challenges in over indexing that way.
So in a world driven by data in a lot of ways, right? Data or metrics or, all of those. And those are the things that get reported in boardrooms, right? To boards, to all of the important places that matter, right? It's not going to be that easy to sort of rely on instinct and gut in those situations, or perhaps to, share that very openly as this is why I'm doing something. Curious about your advice there, right? In a world where founders have to justify their decisions to their employees, to the company, to also their boards, to the investors. How do they navigate that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question or a great follow-up, because when I say instinct, you still have to be thoughtful in your reasoning against it, right? You have to have a strong point of view. It can't just be sort of a hey, this is a gut reaction and I'm going to go with it. You use your instincts, but the instincts come from having deep knowledge of your market, your competitors, where you think the market's headed, what your company uniquely is good at, and all those pieces together, and what your customers are saying, how they're using your product, what kind of feedback are you hearing, what are the pains they're seeing in their day-to-day. And I think all of those pieces together help you get to a point of view which is based off of instincts and then you should use data to validate if you can. Sometimes you might not have the data at 10 million, 5 million in revenue. And that's just the reality, where that's the fun in early stage startups. You're taking bets, and these are high risk bets that could really pay off. That's how you became a company. That's how you started. And you can't forget that. I think a lot of times founders very quickly want to jump into the operational mode, when in reality, it's probably best for the company to stay in the sort of, what made you special company mode. So I think, yeah, it has to be well thought out, and it has to come from a place of deep knowledge. And ideally you can validate it through some type of data, but don't rely fully on just data. Because I think data is a means of communicating. And sometimes you have to use that data to communicate to your board, to your employees. But I think where you can, the trap is to like use data for everything to help you make the decision. I think a lot of times you want to make decisions just off of logic and instincts and then use the data to tell the right story.
I love what you just said back there, the what made you special mode, and I think that really makes a lot of sense because I think for every company that stands out, does well for itself and grows, there is some special secret or not so secret, but some magical ingredient that makes that company uniquely that company and not any other company or brand, right? So I think remembering that very fundamental piece is super important. If there's one thing that Dini Mehta would do differently had you, had to start over and do it all over again, what's that one thing you'd do differently, perhaps?
I would worry less. I had a lot of angst managing my career and feeling like I was on the wrong path and I was not making the right moves and I didn't know where I was headed. And I felt a sense of, and even when I got promoted, I constantly felt the imposter syndrome of like, well, I'm just getting lucky. This isn't because I'm good. And because I didn't have that conviction that I would see my peers having around here's where I'm headed next, or here's where I'm headed in 10 years. And I sort of felt a lot of shame and guilt around not having a very sort of figured out pathway. And so I wish I knew that could be my strength, and it's okay to not know. And it's okay to just sort of, do your best for the next 12 months, 18 months, and then figure it out as you go. Like that's an okay way to manage your career as well. And so I wish I knew that because it would have just saved me a lot of anxiety and angst.
I really, really, truly love that piece, right? And I think it goes straight from your soul to my soul and to, I think, everyone who's going to be listening in because I was incredibly honest. And I think it really will resonate with a lot of folks, who will be listening to this. So I think that's incredible. I think there's so much to be said for it being okay to not know what life is going to look like 5 years, 10 years down the line, right? And I know I used to get this question earlier on in my career of where do you see yourself in 5 years? But I haven't been getting it as much anymore, right? And that's a good thing. I think it's a sign that everyone is sort of evolving to a place where we realize the futility, perhaps, of asking that. And it's certainly a question I do not ask anymore, in my interviews for the most part, unless there's something specific I'm trying to get at. But yeah, I think there's so much to be said for knowing that life and our careers are really an open road. And it's okay to sort of, change paths according to what's in front of us and what seems to be serving us well in that moment. This has been really incredible, Dini. Thank you so much for your time with us. Really incredible.
Thank you. No, this was super fun. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to The Business OS. If you're looking for more resources on how to navigate growth, please go to justcall.io/thebusinessOS. And don't forget, the journey is easier when you have a business OS.